When last we spoke, we ended with Paul Tillich. For those think back to last week's talk, which was about Paul Tillich and how he decided to portray Paul, the Apostle Paul, as a mystic, as someone who's encountering mystical experiences, and from that he's drawing his theology. So, and for the first time in our series, we had a thinker interested in Paul, but who recognized him fundamentally as a mystic. Tonight we turn to a mystic whom we are all familiar with, or most of us, one who is often taken to be an enemy of Paul's Evangelion, his good news. But as with most things in life, and I think this is very true, it is not that simple. And we have this quote here in the bottom. If the quotation from Blake here serves to add anything to our discussion, it is that opposition is true friendship. Though Swedenborg was not a follower of Paul, he was a reader of Paul. He was that most important sort of reader, a critic. He went to Paul not for answers, and so he didn't accept those, and because he did not accept those, I think that was one of the reasons that he was specifically chosen to continue in this line of revelations. He went to Paul not for answers, he had been given his own. He went as an antidote to Paul, a guard, lest the former, the apostle, go too far astray. We've spoken previously about the ubiquitous presence of Paul in the Lutheran tradition, the same tradition in which Swedenborg was raised and in which his intellectual development first began to bloom. Paul is also in Swedenborg in his mature thought and in his own working through of the revelations that were given him. To shake up the dominant power dynamic tonight, can we, and this is a thought that I offer you, can we think of the Apostle Paul as perhaps another earlier Swedenborg, or vice versa? Are they not doing the same thing? Are they not speaking differently, but fundamentally coming from experience to a heightened theology? That's the sort of question that I have this evening. One striking parallel between Paul and Swedenborg is their claim of extraordinary visions of heaven that inaugurated their missions. The Apostle Paul speaks of a man, traditionally understood as Paul himself, who was caught up to the third heaven and heard inexpressible things, things that man is not permitted to tell. That's the quote. And that's from 2 Corinthians. I know a man in Christ, who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things, things that no one is permitted to tell. Emanuel Swedenborg similarly claimed to have his spiritual eyes open to visit the heavenly realms. In fact, Swedenborg explicitly likens his own experiences to Paul's. In De Verbo, a draft work on scriptural interpretation, Swedenborg directly references Paul's account, saying, "It had sometimes been granted me to be among the angels of the middle and highest heaven, when I heard things unutterable and inexpressible," as we read what happened with Paul. He further notes in True Christian Religion that Paul heard from heaven things ineffable, placing Paul in the same category as apostles Peter, James, and John, who momentarily beheld Christ's glory. Swedenborg writes, this is from De Verbo 6, "It has sometimes been granted me to be among the angels in the highest heaven." Oh, I already quoted this. At which time I was in an interior state, removed from bodily things. Then I heard things unutterable, inexpressible, as it happened with Paul. I quoted that same thing twice, but I mean, that's good. It drives it home, really, what we're saying. So, Swedenborg already, very early on, understood his relationship and his experiences in connection with things that had happened to Paul and other mystics throughout history. So I think that's the point that I really want to focus on. Both men's ministries began with such supernatural encounters. Paul's conversion on the Damascus Road, which we encountered in Acts 9, and later his being called to the third heaven, visions gave him, in his opinion, authoritative insights not received from any man. And as we've talked continually throughout the series, Paul was very quick to justify himself, not as called by men, and that's his actual phrasing, but as called by God. Likewise, Swedenborg's spiritual calling around 1745 involved what he described as a direct commission from Jesus Christ to unveil the spiritual meaning of Scripture. This gave Swedenborg confidence to present new doctrines outside traditional theology, in much the same way as Paul introduced the gospel to the Gentile world. This gave Swedenborg confidence to present new, much as Paul gave. As Swedenborgian commentary notes, these dramatic experiences were necessary due to the fact that they were both presenting doctrines never preached before and needed, and the confidence provided from a first-hand experience. I think this is also crucial. Paul and Swedenborg both share that idea. As Swedenborg says, I have seen. This is a similar thing to what Paul said. And I have a point with this, and it's not to make a Pauline point, but we'll get to that soon. In summary, Swedenborg saw Paul's mystical experience as a precedent for his own, and he explicitly uses the language of caught up to heaven as an account that is analogous to his own experiences and visits to the spiritual world. This suggests that Swedenborg viewed Paul almost, and I do mean almost, in the most significant way, as a model of divine revelation. A biblical counterpart validating Swedenborg's claim to have heard things unutterable from heaven, but he also says that what he has heard is manifestly different than what Paul has heard. And I think there's a lesson there. But now we'll start my other ramblings. So can we not see these two individuals as being two important outgrowths of the movement of God in the world? And for this you'll have to forgive my brief meditation on heresy. They are heretics. I'm saying both Paul and Swedenborg, or that's sort of the social element in which they were put. So both of them. So they are heretics in a very certain sense. And that is where I wish to begin tonight's discussion, with the meditation on the importance of heresy for the life of the divine and for the church. When Swedenborg encountered the risen Lord in 1744, I don't know why I said 1745 earlier, I wrote it down wrong, Europe and much of the world had been Christian in some sense for almost 2,000 years. Easter was close on that 6th of April. And the fire that started this movement, its radical demands, its message from the resurrected Lord, had retreated from being a divine reality at the center of the cosmos, and was just another established fact in the law and sciences. What once commended, and I'm speaking about Christianity more generally here, so it is, for 2,000 years Europe had been Christian, yet the fire of early Christianity had, I think, gone out well into the 18th century, maybe before. So this idea that things have been radically changed at the center of the cosmos, that this later became just another established fact. What once commended the death of the martyrs had become a hollow truism. How does the world, which has already accepted Christianity in its radical world-denying sense, remain Christian? Though Søren Kierkegaard would struggle with this half a century later, I would argue that this question was already posed by Swedenborg. What had changed? So just as the first revelation, what had changed? Everything. And yet who realized it? None. This idea that there has been a breaking forth of new revelation. And yet for most people their lives were the same as before and after. And this is something that Swedenborg is specifically speaking toward. Swedenborg was like Paul in that moment. Something had changed, something universal, something cosmic. But how does one tell it? What do we make of it? Where do we take it? Like Paul before him, Swedenborg was the recipient of a calling that demanded more of him than he had to give. And he would spend the remainder of his life trying to come to terms with it, and to pour out over endless pages his own understanding of the visions and what he took them to mean. Nunc licet, now it is permitted. Like Paul, he stood as a heretic on the way to the way things were, and he was bringing forth a new thought to set the world on fire once again. Though Paul plays up his election as an apostle, something gnaws within him, as we've seen repeatedly. His calling was not mediated by the physical presence of Jesus, and the mystical statement then and now, all mystical statements in general, come with a baggage that is uniquely their own. Where does one person's fantasy or hallucination, if you want to use a medical term, stand in relation to another's revelation? The truth is, and I think this is something that all believers and all acceptors of this message must struggle with in their own way. So the truth is uncomfortably difficult to separate. But that's not what we're going with here. To be a recipient of a new revelation always means to stand up for and against what has been received. Tradition creates traditions, and seals of the prophets, various other expressions, way showers, the tradition of John the Baptist, preparing the way for Christ. And people, so I remember now what I'm trying to say there. So because we are talking about religious traditions, traditions create narratives that explain themselves. And very often, when you have one revelation, the churches, and I mean, religious traditions more generally, are very willing to move beyond the revelations that they accept. So, and they try to come up with a wide variety of reasons for this. So we have the seal of the prophets, for instance, in Islam, that Muhammad is the end, he's the final prophet. So all revelation has to go back through him. And if you have new revelation, it has to be threaded in some strange way to show that it's not really new, it's just part of something that wasn't previously understood. And this was also the tradition in the reception of John the Baptist, where you saw him as preparing the way for Christ. That was the way it was interpreted. And the reason that that occurred is because in the first century, there were people who accepted John the Baptist as the Messiah, but not Jesus. And they're actually around today. They're called Mandaeans. So we have within this worldview, that once you receive a revelation, it always means people want finality. They want an end to that. And that's what we see with Paul. Any other gospel, do not accept, only mine. So, what do we do with that? But in the time, it is often heresy. And that includes even the stories of Paul himself. There were people who disagreed with him and pushed back against him. Any new revelation is always going to bring issue with the previous. And perhaps revealing heterodoxy, meaning different teachings, is part of that process of divine revelation, that process of struggling with what new voice is coming through. Bishop William Warburton humorously said, orthodoxy, right teaching, is my doxy. Heterodoxy is another man's doxy. And I think there is some very powerful truth to that. And I would also say, and I'm trying to be funny here, I can't say God cares so much for orthodoxy. He's always reminding us that his thoughts are not our thoughts. And just to give you one recommendation, or one clear example of this, we have his encounter with Moses. He reprimanded Moses. And, in that moment where Moses was meeting God at the burning bush, he said, though you believe, you could paraphrase this, that though you believe I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I am not like a pet god of some specific wandering tribe. And he does this in the most, I think, powerful words. He says, remove your shoes, for the ground on which you stand is holy. A recognition that something different is occurring here. And that was, I think, especially when you look earlier in the Torah, you see the radical change that is. It's not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's something much deeper. Remove your shoes. He says, my ways are not your ways. My kingdom, remember the story of Jesus, is not the same kingdom you would want. When Jesus is asked, where his kingdom is, he says, it's not of this world. My kingdom isn't the kind of kingdom you're thinking of. My death is also not the same as your death. My death gives life. previous life and previous deaths do not. And the most radical statement I think that Swedenborg seized upon, I and the Father are one, which is the heart of the radical message of Swedenborg's Christology. To the orthodox minded, these are heretics, these are heresy. And I ask the question rhetorically, but also to drive home a point, perhaps the Lord is also a heretic. There is a childishness, I think, in thinking that God does or cannot change. And it sort of reminds me of those who want Mama to read the same story over and over and always use the same voices, point out the same things. We want God to be a purveyor of our own understanding of order, to be the great unchanging that we feel we need. And he is always reminding us that he will not be condensed by our wants. And heretics are often the best models or the recipients of that message. Unlike those who walked before, a heretic asked the fundamental question, why? Why is it thus? To the enemies of New Christianity, they spew and sputter and quote from Paul's letters, each with an unspoken gotcha built in. I've often had this when you try to debate Swedenborg's ideas. They say, well, Paul says this, as though that's an answer. But if we put Paul and Swedenborg on the same level, we can ask this question, who really got whom? Revelation is a tricky thing, and in the Torah, prophecy was easy to verify. Did what one say happen? Yes. If it did, okay, you're a prophet. If not, you're a false prophet. Easy. We might add, and I think this is the real point that I have here, does a prophecy or revelation help you engage more deeply with the world? Does it demand you be better than you are as it stands? Does it push you beyond complacency? Does it challenge you? Historically, heresy brings about anger, then thought, shock, then consideration. Does Swedenborg and Paul not follow these same patterns? So, to recap, rethink, reconsider, if Paul is the recipient of the mystery of God, as he says he was, then why is this unthinkable in terms of Swedenborg? If there is the same comparable experience, and I'm really asking this question more for, Christians the world around, why is one automatically accepted and correct and the other categorically wrong or impossible? Swedenborg was remarkably aware of the difficulties in conveying the truth of the Lord, and he repeatedly stresses that human language and intellect are insufficient to fully capture spiritual realities. As Kervin astutely notes in his preface to Secrets of Heaven, even as he describes the wonders of heaven and the depths of scriptural meanings, he acknowledges that his accounts are reduced to natural terms and thus inevitably fall short. For example, Swedenborg's note that after unveiling the deeper spiritual or heavenly meanings, what it really means, and this is a paraphrase, finally, what it means in its point is unintelligible in the sense of someone who's receiving this. It's beyond comprehension. Swedenborg further stresses the primacy of personal decision, and in a letter to the king, a king of Sweden in 1770, he writes, and I added this in, and I got to go back, sorry, that the Chancery of Justice now relates that they still cannot believe it, meaning his revelations, I cannot take amiss, since I cannot put my state of sight and speech into the heads of others, and so convince them, nor can I cause angels and spirits to talk with them, nor is it permitted that miracles should occur nowadays. But reason itself shall find it true, when with reflection they read my writings. It is a choice. And choice is part of the origin of the term heresy, and it comes from the Greek hieromai, which is the option to choose or the act of choosing. Both thinkers invite us to choose. Swedenborg even acknowledges that there is value in choices outside his own revelation. As he says, when it's possible to understand the reflection of God's love even in other religions. Follow if you are so compelled, he reminds us, But firstly, be aware, and do not use the stories of your fathers to justify what you yourselves claim to believe. And this reminds of John the Baptist's statement in the 3rd chapter of Matthew, verses 8 through 9. Bring forth, therefore, fruits, meet for repentance, and think not to say within yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. For I say unto you, that God is able of these stones to raise up children of Abraham. At the very least, Swedenborg, in my opinion, has done this. He was an acute reader of Paul, and he gives us the courage to say with conviction, why do you speak for the resurrected Lord? And I think that that is really the question that we have been dealing with. That is the question of this seminar, and that's the question that I feel like Swedenborg emboldens. Why are you speaking for the resurrected Lord? Powerful question. And I end again, I think I put this in here, if not, yes, this is again from 1770. So, some almost, 2 years before he dies. Read if you please, and afterwards draw a conclusion, but from reason. He has a very great faith that through seeing things in the simple terms of success and usefulness, that you will see truth, but from reason concerning my revelation. So read it, be critical, be thoughtful, and see what it says to you, which in some ways is actually what the Lord himself says when he repeatedly said, and who do you say that I am? He asked Peter. Swedenborg engaged deeply with Paul's doctrinal statements, often re-examining them in the light of his own revelations. Though the doctrine of sola fide is the primary task from which Swedenborg condemns the reception of Paul by Protestants, it is interesting that Swedenborg essentially believes that in his heart, Paul is closer to the New Church interpretation than to those offering sola fideism. So I actually just realized now that I'd left out an entire point. As I end this sort of meditation, I just want to just push that thought experiment, which is not so radical for us. But if we removed the prestige that Paul's writings have received and set him in the same area with Swedenborg, and if we believe, as Swedenborg tells us, that there is an inherent value in human reason, then this has to give us a way to deal with the claims of Paul and the claims of Swedenborg. And I think at the very least what I'm trying to do there, which is sort of strange in this audience, is I wanted to remove the pedestal that people have traditionally put on Paul and get us to rethink about what that means to speak and what that means to speak of revelation. And so now, after that, I feel like the best way that we can do that is to show the way that Swedenborg himself engaged with Paul. And that was the point that I left out there. So he does read Paul, that's very important. But he also believes that, one, Paul confirms more of his own opinions, and that Paul, as we talked about this sort of chip on Paul's shoulder about his own revelations, that is also, that is a form of his own egoism, and he addresses that as well, very powerfully, I would say. So in this section, we are going to study how Swedenborg understands the writings of Paul, how he depicts Paul in the spirit world, and then we will examine Swedenborg's understanding of Paul's own doctrine of justification, the sola fide argument aside. So what did Paul himself say about justification? And the ending section will help us to introduce the final selection of the seminar, in which we will address primarily the ambiguity. So I'm trying to build two camps, the pro-Paul version, the anti-Paul version, and at the end we're going to talk about the ambiguity, and I'm going to connect it with the same theme I talked about here, which is the ambiguity of revelation itself. So now, with that very long intro, let's go here to Swedenborg as a critic of Paul. And this is really, so I include two things here. You have the Latin text there in case anybody is unhappy with the way that I've translated it. So if you see anything that you think is I'm being too strong with, point it out. So this is the most central critique that Swedenborg has of Paul. And we're going to talk about the levels at which this is playing and the way he comes to this conclusion. But it's a very important and pregnant quote with a lot of meaning that we have to go over. So, from Spiritual Experience 48:24, that the epistles of Paul do not possess an internal sense, a higher meaning is known in the other life. Yet it has been permitted that they be in the church, lest those who from the church would do evil to the word of the Lord, in which the internal sense is, and should thereby harm it. For if a person lives evilly and yet believes the word to be holy, then they do harm to heaven. Therefore the epistles of Paul were permitted, and for this reason it was not permitted to Paul to take up a single parable, nor even a doctrine from the Lord, and set it forth and explain it. But he took all things from himself. The church indeed expounds the word of the Lord, but through the epistles of Paul, and therefore everywhere departs from the good of charity, and takes the truth of faith, which indeed the Lord taught, but in such a way that the good of charity should be the all. So let us break this down a little further. So we find here non sensum internum habeant. And this phrase means, referring to the letters of Paul, that this is, first of all, not a soft statement. It's not an easy accusation. It's saying that the writings of Paul themselves are completely and totally absent of the inner sense, the higher spiritual meaning that suffices the canonical words or the other testimonies in the Bible. Notum est in altera vita. And he's coming to this conclusion sort of, I would say, strangely, because he says that in the other life, this is well known. And he's trying to make that realization known in our world. But fundamentally, what he's saying is that, he's trying to bring the letters of Paul down with the type of revelation he's bringing, and he's showing that there's a great deal of want in the letters of Paul. And this is, I think, one of the most interesting. Permissum est in ecclesia sent. And I think the permissum here that he says, this is key to how I think Swedenborg understands the entirety of Paul's letters and their function within the church, that the Lord has permitted them. And why? Swedenborg comes to the conclusion that in several cases, the writings of Paul have been allowed to continue within the Christian faith simply because they were part of early Christian connections. And to strip one meant stripping the others. And Swedenborg often talked about this utility that even in the darkest, most evil, horrible desires, that there is some way that the Lord can turn that around and make that useful for his kingdom. And we see that very much in the writings of Paul, that though the true revelation of God's love and enduring presence are not found within them, sometimes because of their harshness, because of their of the weight that they have to the Christian world in general, people have preserved them. And that's not in vain. That the Lord allowed this to occur, and that they function almost as apocryphal. They're interpretations that people have raised to Scripture, but without them, many of elements of the Bible would not have been preserved till today. And as Swedenborg shows, this is the clearest way that the influence from heaven can be experienced in the world. So, it's permitted, it's not an endorsement. Permissum est ut in ecclesia sent. It is permitted. Male vivit malum facit cello. So that there is a misalignment in the writings of Paul between life and his professed sanctity, And this has a direct negative impact on heaven's orders, which we lead here. Lest those who from the church would do evil to the word of the Lord, in which the internal sense is. For a person lives evilly and yet believes the word to be holy, then they do harm to heaven. Therefore, the epistle of Paul were permitted. So there is this sort of other element as well, that the writings of Paul are specifically given toward creating a space at which this kind of interaction can happen. And that, as we'll see here, that he's trying to, that the Lord does this because it allows further insight and visitation. Next, we have the line, "Assemit omnia sumsit." So Swedenborg here is sharply contrasting Paul's epistles with text infused from the Lord's own inspiration. And as he says very clearly here, Paul is taking all of his own revelations from himself, that he is seeing himself in this position. And finally, this gives the frame that the Pauline legacy of the church is actually skewing the church from love, charity, the absolute substance of religion, and toward true faith as a abstraction. And although it is reversing the actual will of the Lord, in some cases it's essential for that preservation. And Karen brought up a point one time when we were talking about the Our Father, and there is this line that says, "O Lord, lead us not into temptation." And the point that she said, which I thought was very good at the time, is that the Lord can lead us with temptation at certain points, and actually uses our own negative wills and wants to guide us toward levels of holiness that we are not ourselves expecting. And I think that that's a very important element here. So Paul's letters function analogously, and I think that this is important as well, to apocryphal Hebrew Bible books. And we know there are several of them in the Catholic Bible and the Orthodox Bibles, but these are books that are considered maybe good, maybe inspired, but they're not universally acknowledged as such. And the way that the Anglican Church talks about it is useful for instruction, but not a conduit of actual revelation. And I think that is also what Swedenborg's saying here. If in any ways it's almost this negative hull that exists to bring at some point the revelation of God in, but very often it works against that revelation. And I think that is also why Swedenborg's was called, why his revelation was called as well. So, oh yes, sorry, I wrote all these down. So we have all of this, that there's no internal sense, that it causes a disruption between the two forms of life, that it's permitted by the Lord but not encouraged, and that it actually, in some cases, if you take Paul too extremely, it actually works against the movings of heaven, and it clouds the veracity of faith and the veracity of true charity. So, oh yes, I've left out all kinds of things. Sorry, you guys. Paul's letters function analogously to the apocryphal Old Testament books, useful for instruction, tolerated for the sake of the church, but not a conduit of the word's influx of heaven. From heaven, not into heaven. And Swedenborg makes an additional point, and this is the Latin here, and I apologize I don't have them side by side, and if anybody wants the Latin, I can send it to them. But this is also from Spiritual Diaries, number 4412. Concerning Paul. Paul is among the worst of the apostles, a fact made known through much experience. The amor sui, or love of the self, with which he has been ensnared before he preached the gospel, remained with him even afterwards. So Swedenborg here is acknowledging that there was a contact between the Lord and Paul, but that it was poisoned by his own ego. And because he was then almost in the same state, being stirred by that love of the self and by his nature, so that he desired to be among the crowds, he did all things with the end in view that he might be the greatest in heaven and judge the 12 tribes of Israel. And I think that we do see this, that Paul at some times goes well beyond what he's seeing as I think that he does. He inserts himself in very dramatic ways. That he afterward remains such is established from much experience. This is a very interesting point. For I have spoken with him more than with others. So when Swedenborg went to the next world, who's he encountering? Indeed, such is he that the other apostles in the other life have rejected him from their company, nor do they any longer acknowledge him as one of them. Also, because he has joined himself with one of the worst devils, who wills to rule over all things. Remember that in the spiritual world we are connected with our deepest driving passions. So that's interesting. And pledged himself to him that he would obtain this. Besides many other matters which it would be too prolix to relate. All the things I know about Paul, if they were written down, would fill volumes. That he wrote the epistles does not testify to his being other than such, other than a writer. For even the impious can preach well and write letters. Let's think about that for a second. For even the impious can preach well and write letters. And Swedenborg is saying in some cases God acknowledges this and works with that, but it's also a very profound statement about the value of revelations, which is, if it's not continuing the love and further appreciation for humankind, what value does it have? To be is one thing, and to speak and write another, which was also said of him. Moreover, in his epistles, he has not so much as mentioned a single word of what the Lord taught, nor a single word of one of his parables. This line, by the way, comes from a very old tradition of Christian Jewish thought called Ebionitism, which was essentially, contra Paul view, but that was a common complaint that he didn't really know anything about Jesus, so he didn't quote a lot from him. That's not entirely true, I'd say, but there's a lot of truth in that. And thus he took nothing from the Lord's life and speech, which was also said to him. Although in the evangelists there is the gospel itself. So as we've been talking about throughout this seminar, Paul sort of usurps the role of the gospel itself. He becomes a speaker who he becomes a speaker for the resurrected Lord, and yet it is difficult at points to distinguish what is his from what is in fact the divine revelation. So let's talk for just like we did in the last one. Let me see if I wrote these down. Yes, okay. So these are, I think, some points from this most recent thing that we can talk. And the first is love of oneself, the amor sui. One of Swedenborg's most central moral categories. The primal spiritual corruption. So we have love of self and love of God. And these are the two opposition points. And these are and they contradict each other. And love of the neighbor. In heaven and hell, the love of the self is the essence of hellish life and the root of all desire to dominate. And he's using this to describe Paul's spiritual state in the other world. Omnia eget ex fine, he did all things from his end in view. So Swedenborg's doctrines of ends, the finis or purpose, is the governing principle of the inner purpose, of the inner person. A hellish end corrupts even externally good works. The identification of Paul's ends as self-exaltation places him in opposition to heavenly order. Maximus esset in cello, that he might be the greatest in heaven, echoes the inversion in the Lord's teaching of Matthew 20, 26, and 27. Swedenborg regularly applies this as a diagnostic of hypocrisy. Aspiring to heavenly greatness for the sake of the self is paradoxically to invert heaven's hierarchy. So say, I'm the greatest of apostles, I've not been called by men. when you have that view, that's not a reflection of the divine's gift to you. That's a reflection of your own will to dominate. And I do not think that you can read the letters of Paul and not accept some of that claim. And also, the same thing that Swedenborg talks about doctrines of ends, Paul is writing in such a way to define himself as a true apostle. And that's not easy. And very there's a lot of issues with that. And he tells us also that the apostles have rejected Paul from their company. In Swedenborg's afterlife description, spiritual societies are structured by inner likeness. Rejection from an apostolic society signifies a complete lack of inward communion with that spiritual function or office. So, and uni expessimus diabolus regere omnia, one of the worst devils to rule over all things. Swedenborg's hell is organized by ruling loves. To will to rule over all things is the definitive mark of an infernal dominion. That Paul allied with such a spirit is a theological verdict of extreme severity. Aliud est esse et aliud est loque et scribere. To be is one thing, and to speak and write is another. And that there is no unity between the actions of Paul and his own charity. External utterances and internal characters are radically distinct. This distinction underlies his doctrine of correspondences and his sharp critique, Swedenborg's, of religious hypocrisy, which he's seeing in Paul. Ne verbulum mimoverat nec unum parabolam. Not a single word, not one parable. Does the writings of Paul give us insight into the resurrected Lord itself? And this is a point to Swedenborg that is of the highest importance. That not one word of gospel, Luther said that there was not one word of gospel in the book of James. Well, this accusation can come home because Swedenborg is saying that there is no inroad to the teachings of the Lord themselves in the writings of Paul. It's only into his own theological understanding. It's a very interesting point. And Swedenborg actually goes one step further by insisting that his experiences are what he is building his ideas on. He's not working from a theological framework, which I think Paul is very clearly doing. He's seeing things, he's experiencing things, and then he's working. And unlike Paul, who has essentially one religious experience, or we know of, Swedenborg is having continual. So he's always talking about what he's experiencing, etc. So not a single word, not one parable, emphasizes Swedenborg's valuations of the gospel over anything that would account as epistolary or post-apostolic doctrinal developments. Again, why do you speak for the Lord? That's the question. Why is it that because the church says it's one way, that it is one way? And because both of them were coming from this experiential side, that gave them the freedom to ask that question. And I think Swedenborg is much more compelling, but that's just me, as you know. So it aligns with his claim that the gospel itself, the word, the transcendent element in the books that we read reside in the Lord's own words, his life, his teachings, and his parables, not merely and not especially in later theological exposition. This diary entry stands out as one of Swedenborg's most pointed post-mortem assessments of a biblical figure. The worst, I would say. It encapsulates several of his enduring doctrinal emphases. So we have here the absolute primacy of ruling love in determining spiritual states, the difference between external ministry and internal quality, and the authority of the Lord's direct teachings over any, and I put over later ecclesiastical traditions, I would say more radical, over any ecclesiastical traditions, and the structuring of the spiritual world into societies formed by inner likenesses, including the possibility of radical disjunction between nominally united figures. Again, and I know you people are probably tired of hearing this now, why are you speaking for Paul? Why are you speaking for the Lord? That's the question. Why are you speaking for God? And just because you're unified, talk about the four apostles and Paul, that doesn't make you an apostle. So in some ways, Swedenborg's going back to the very earliest doctrines of the church to say, no, why does your revelation and your interpretation become the only one? And if you like, I can cross-reference this with Swedenborg's related doctrine in Heavenly Doctrine and True Christian Religion to show that these same principles recur in less polemical context. And that would help this situate this otherwise jarring portrait of Paul within the whole theological architecture. Now, I'm not going to do that for one reason, because I'm shifting out some of these things. But, and let's see our time. Yes, okay. So, let me see here. Okay. And I just realized that I didn't save the rest of the files in any event. But so avoiding that particular issue, let's go, I think, to the heart of what Swedenborg sees as the issue with Paul, and that is in his discussion of justification by faith. So Lutherans of Swedenborg's day cited Paul's work, "Man is justified by faith without the works of the law," Romans 3:28, as support for the sola fide idea. Swedenborg argued this line was widely misunderstood. In Divine Providence 11:15, he clarifies that by works of the law, Paul meant the rituals of Mosaic law, such as circumcision or dietary rules, not the Ten Commandments or moral good works. He points out that Paul himself immediately adds, "Do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid, rather we establish the law." Romans 3:31. So you see here, Swedenborg is using Paul's own words. Swedenborg notes that those who isolate Paul's statements about faith while ignoring its context fall into blindness, induced from the single passage being wrongly understood. In other words, Paul taught that faith accompanied by charity and good works, a view Swedenborg emphasizes was his actual intent, but this wasn't the points that people took from it, which is why, it's become so insidious. And this aligns very much with his idea that New Church doctrine, that faith and charity are the principles of the church. Without one, you cannot have the other. So, I'm actually, just to keep everyone's attention and also time in mind, I think that is where we're going to stop. And I'm going to tell you why I think that, because if we continue, I think that would push us, first of all, a little bit further on, and I think that we can probably save that for next week. But what is more, let me just close with this. As we are reading Paul in Swedenborg, what I don't want people to think is that there is an inherent bias that Swedenborg hates everything to do with Paul and that Paul has nothing to offer. That's not his point. But it's a much more subtle one. And that is that even in the writings of Paul as we have them, there is fundamentally a misalignment that people have begun to see the works of Paul as having direct connection to the Lord itself. And that is to the Lord himself. And that was the thing that Swedenborg wished to break apart, to reevaluate and to re-question. And with that, let's go to our discussion session.